Hello and welcome to Conversation about History of CREES. Today we will be talking to two professors and former directors of the center. Katherine Verdery, she is the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at City University of New York. And, I should remind that she was Director of CREES between 2000 and 2001. And MichaelKennedy, 2000-2002.
But her influence was so great, it felt like at least a decade.
The rest of the decade.
And MichaelKennedy, Professor of Sociology and International Studies, he was Director of CREES 3 times, 1995 to 1998, Interim Director in 1999, and then again from 2005 and 2008.
I'm glad you could remember, because I couldn't remember exactly.
I've practiced. And I'm Olga Virakhovskaya. I'm a proud graduate of the CREES program, 1996. Welcome. The two of you directed CREES for between the late 1990s until the late 2000s, and has been a very interesting period. What were the major accomplishments of the center that you, during the times of your directorships? We will start with Michael and maybe then go to Katherine and go back to Michael.
Okay.
So, well, I remember the first brown bag I did, I think in 1995, was called Whither CREES.
I remember it.
You do remember?
Yes.
So it's W-H-I, not W-I-T-H. But it was a question, because so much of CREES depended upon a Cold War notion. But our Michigan CREES was already ahead of the curve, I think. I remember my predecessor, Jane Burbank, had already initiated a lot of collaboration with the William Davidson Institute and trying to think about how MBAs might advise with a little bit more contextual expertise than they typically had. So that was ongoing, and that continued and was an important influence in my work. But I think the most important thing for me in that first period was a project supported by the Ford Foundation called Identity Formation and Social Issues in Estonia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. Mm-hmm. And most people said at the time that this comparison made no sense. But I think because it was such an unusual comparison, it gained the interest of many, because instead of trying to find out what was the critical difference among particular places, we were trying to figure out what was common among such radically disparate places as Estonia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. And it was a terrific project, not just because of the idea, in fact, least because of the idea, and most of all because of the people who were involved. We had these wonderful graduate students from Anthropology, Sociology, CREES, and other departments. And we had wonderful collaborators from Uzbekistan, Ukraine, and Estonia who remain friends of CREES and friends of ours to this day. And I think maybe the last thing to note that was of special significance, at least during the 1990s of my directorship, was the Polish Roundtable event of 1999. I can still remember sitting in Lane Hall in the library. We were all sitting around the table and we were all saying, we know we need to celebrate the 1989 anniversary in a couple of years, but we don't want to do it the same way as we always do. So how are we going to get away from thinking about 1999 with that metaphor of a wall crashing? And then we realized, we could actually think about it in a much more constructive way. How was 1989 made instead of how did 1989 happen? And so thinking about how Poles from all sides of the political spectrum, not all sides, but many sides of the political spectrum came together to negotiate communism's collapse became a terrific inspiration for us. And again, it wasn't just with what we had at Michigan, but with the partners that we had from across the world, in particular our colleagues from the Solidarity Movement, former communists, and church officials who came to Michigan to be able to have a conversation about the roundtable that they couldn't have in Poland. In fact, and this will be my last remark, I remember sitting in the President's Palace in 1998, and we were there and we said to President Kwasniewski, we would like to have an event commemorating the Polish Round Table. We don't want to just commemorate it, we want to understand it better from a social scientific perspective. We want to be able to bring people together to ask questions that they may not have considered. And he sat there, and then he turned to his advisor and said, "Why did we think of that?" So that's the best kind of collaborator you can have. Not only somebody who praises you, but who has a little bit of authority to carry it along.
Well, my directorship was much briefer than Michael's, and also I left the University of Michigan several years ago, so lots of things are not quite as fresh in my mind as they would be if I'd been rubbing shoulders with people all this time. When you suggested that we think about the accomplishments, the first thing that came to my mind was the very prosaic matter of renewing the Title VI funding that we had, and during my directorship we had to put in for renewal and succeeded in getting it. But I remember that as being an extremely frantic time with everybody running around and getting figures and coming up with things that we could put into our application so that it would be successful. And this was my first exposure to close working with this marvelous staff that CREES had at that time. And most of them are still there, as far as I know. Marisha, Donna, Roberta, Sylvia with fundraising, and Linda was also there. So that's not a big event, but it was a big event. I mean, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the whole problematic of area studies centers became much more controversial around the country. And so throughout the decade of the 90s, there were questions about whether Congress was going to continue to fund this, and every time the funding cycle was to begin, there was more sort of anxiety about whether it was actually going to get the funding from Congress. So I think it's important that we keep in mind this sort of ongoing low-level anxiety around the funding that was mitigated only to some extent by the events of 9/11, and that happened while I was director. So at that point, suddenly there was more interest in area studies again from the political sector. And for Russian East European area studies in particular, there was a little bit of spin-off benefit because suddenly Central Asia looked very important to people in Washington. And it was therefore, Russia and Central Asia kind of made it onto the priority list for funding at the Title VI directors meeting that I attended here. Other kinds of things that I remember were the CREES sort of being a lead player in further integrating the area studies centers under the umbrella of the International Institute, so ably led by my colleague here to my left, because that was a complicated process as well, and the area studies centers were used to having their own sort of autonomy, and now they were being asked to give up autonomy in order to be under this larger organization. But it was all part of the overshadowing of the idea of area studies by a new emphasis on globalization and internationalization of the university and so on. So those I think of as particularly important to sort of general happenings. Specifically for me, it was a very great source of pride and satisfaction that we were able to hire a Central Asian specialist, and that was something that I was working on. I can't remember if Doug Northrup was actually hired while I was still director, but I was active in trying to get that appointment, and it was such a spectacular hire. Now he's running the center, so that's something that I'm very proud to recall.
Moving forward.
So I came back after being the II director until 2004. I had a year off. And then I came back to direct not only CREES, but also the Center for European Studies, European Union Center. And this was a moment, I think, where we were trying to work out what was this new complication for Russian and East European studies, and that is that in 2004, of course, so many of our beloved countries entered the European Union. Some of our beloved countries entered a little later. But I recall even before, when our Polish or Czech or Hungarian colleagues would come, they would say, well, wait a minute, why are we coming to the Center for Russian and East European Studies? Why aren't we coming to the Center for European Studies? So, by being director of both, between 2005 and 2008, we created a productive ambiguity. So whenever people wanted to visit, we could say, well, we can both host you. And in fact, thinking about the relationship between the European Union and Eurasia was a way for us to get over the question of what country was where, and rather to think about the character of relationships in space and time. And that kind of intellectual creativity actually had, which is relatively unusual for universities, an organizational spin-off. And that was to be able to talk with one of our most enduring and significant supporters, Ron Weiser, about how it is that we could bring Russian East European studies and European studies into more effective dialogue, but not just in terms of area studies, but along his own particular interests. And he was especially interested in how to facilitate democracies across the world. And we suggested maybe that's too big an agenda at the start. Maybe it would be better to focus on those countries in the post-communist world where American advice might be a little bit more welcome. And so in that 2005-2008 period, I think one of the novel things about that was the creation of a more synergistic relationship between the European and the Russian East European sides of things, but also to think about how our region can contribute to thematic issues, especially about how you build democracies out of authoritarian or dictatorial conditions. So that was a nice period. But I think with Katherine, one of the things that I would want to say about all of these periods is that what has made CREES special are the people who have endured throughout. Marisha and Donna and Rachel now and Roberta and so many of the other colleagues from all of this time. And our beloved students. I think I was one of your readers on your master's thesis, if I recall correctly. And one of the things that I enjoy most is to look at the number of people from I think the first master's thesis I did was 1988. So going from 1988 all the way to 2009, to look at all these wonderful MA students that CREES has produced, and all these wonderful undergraduate concentrations, and this beloved survey course that we had, which, for a guest lecture course, it's amazing to see how coherent it was, how thoughtful it was, and how many students who had no interest necessarily in Eastern Europe or Russia would come into the fold as a consequence of the wonderful colleagues we had here in the Center for Russian and East European Studies.
You talked a little bit about events in the region. Of course, it's impossible to talk about CREES without tying somehow to the events. And the next question I have is, what specific impact had these events on students, faculty members, professors?
Well, I think the event with the biggest impact that I recall is what I mentioned a moment ago, and that was 9/11, with this enormous mobilization of faculty and student and community interest in producing something sort of vaguely reminiscent of the teach-ins of the 1960s, although not on quite the same scale. But I remember panel discussions on Iraq with people like Juan Cole in the these huge auditoriums with enormous numbers of people in attendance. And the feeling that something had irrevocably changed that was going to affect all of our lives and all of the areas of the world that had any tangency with those events. I think on a much different kind of scale, we celebrated the 300th anniversary of the founding of St. Petersburg, which was a very different kind of event, right? Not happening out there in the world, but in our moments of recollection. But for CREES, that was actually the biggest event production in the time of my directorship, following upon the earlier roundtable commemoration that Michael mentioned. So even though the St. Petersburg celebration didn't happen until after I stopped being director, there was a lot of activity connected with it throughout the time that I was doing the work.
Yeah, I mean, of course, one of the things that characterizes our center is that it seems that it has lived by anniversaries very often. And I think 89, right? 89 was so significant that other events often lived in its shadow, but they didn't really. But I think what 89 was so significant in doing was that it wound up setting that sort of initial framework with which other things were then understood. But one of the things that was very difficult for CREES, of course, were wars of Yugoslav succession. And I recall in particular thinking around those 78 days of NATO bombing of Serbia, right? And this was one of those events which of course has terrific repercussions today, because it was in this time where I think so many academics began to doubt the formulas made during the Vietnam War. There was a much more significant kind of discussion about the relationship between military and peacekeeping and NGO forces in post-conflict situations than there had been previously. So even from 95 through 99 and after. And I remember one event which was rather poignant for me, and that was the conversation between military officials and NGOs who were in Bosnia, I believe, talking about how it is that they couldn't coordinate well with each other. Mm. Because the NGO officials said, the NGO activists said, for us the most important thing is to get to where we can help most. And the military officials said, and our most important mission is to keep you away from there. Mm. And this was the beginning of, I think, a lot of scholars and civil servants and NGO activists trying to rethink how it is that we can function most effectively in the world when there are no simple demarcations between peace and war. And I think, in light of contemporary events around, the question of military intervention in Libya, we should be looking not only to the moment of 1999 and the bombing of Serbia, but we should be thinking about Pristina and Kosovo in 2011. Not just the moments that are important, but the enduring effects of those decisive choices. Mm-hmm. And this is where area studies makes a difference. Everybody's going to pay attention to Libya today. Everybody's paid attention to Tahrir Square a couple months ago. Everybody paid attention to Kosovo in 1999. But we need to keep attention on these places. And the only way that this happens is not by disciplines, but by area studies, because we have the geographical, cultural investments that make the cumulative learning possible, so that we're not forgetting what Kosovo teaches us over these last 12 years when we think about what liberal humanitarian interventionism means today.
Moving forward with our questions, Thank you for this answer. What is different about CREES? What makes these programs unique? What are what are the events that make CREES unique? What are the programs?
Well, back to the St. Petersburg anniversary, I think we can hold that up as a really spectacularly successful initiative on the part of CREES that brought together people in so many different disciplines across this campus and in the community of Ann Arbor, and even coming from farther away, to concerts, and there was a huge symposium, an architecture symposium that had famous architects here for a conversation that they hadn't had in other parts of the world. And Valery Gergiev came to conduct, I think he was doing something at the Detroit Symphony, I can't remember now, but in any case, he was here for one of those symposia, and we got to have lunch with him, and he's such an extraordinary figure in world culture today, and it was a remarkable experience. And then other kinds of more sort of typically academic, sociologists, historians, anthropologists getting together and talking about the importance of St. Petersburg in its time. And so it was just interdisciplinary, doesn't begin to capture the scope of that event. And this is just second nature to somebody like Marisha, who was instrumental in conceptualizing the whole thing, just being able to think across the whole array of possibly interested people and to generate interest from faculty by having special themes, semesters, and things of this kind. So students were brought into it through coursework, and the community through all these events. Just, I think, a signature CREES event for that set of years.
I think you're so smart to bring two people who left Michigan together to be able to talk about this, because, at Brown, I can see more clearly what makes CREES so special. And that is that, and, in comparison to other area studies centers, other area studies center directors, but I think CREES is remarkable because of the character of the way in which it thinks about area studies. It's not something that people own and say, you're only allowed to join if you speak an East European or Eurasian language fluently. No, it's anyone who has a serious and abiding interest, and maybe even a fleeting one, because fleeting interest can turn into abiding interest. And you pull them in because of Gergiev, or you pull them in because of Kvasniewski, or you pull them in because of that survey course. And so this vision of our greatest resource not being an endowment, but being able to reach out and stimulate interest among the already converted and the possibly interested is the first thing that makes CREES great. But then the second thing is that it's, it has a personnel structure that reaches out across the university and across the community and across the world. I think because of Marisha, because of Donna, and occasionally because of the faculty who are involved, it had an ambition that was never somehow ugly. It was always a beautiful ambition because it was wanting to share rather than a wish to climb.
But I would also add that for all the complexities of creating and growing the International Institute, it had a very helpful synergistic effect in precisely the ways that we're talking about, because it amplified the initiatives of any one center director, first of all towards involving the other center directors in co-sponsorships, and secondly to creating conversations among center directors so that people could try to bring some of their interests into alignment, and then really amplify the significance of what any one person might be thinking of doing. So I want to give you credit for the extraordinary initiative that you took as II director in helping people come together in this very synergistic way.
Catherine is so sweet, but it all depends on
It's
where
true.
it all depends on where you put the apostrophe. We had a group called the Directors Group, but the apostrophe was after the S rather than before the
Yes,
S.
that's true. That's true.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I think we're out of time already.
Okay, well, this has been a great opportunity to come together and think again about a wonderful institution.
And I look forward to the celebration, the next 50th anniversary of CREES, because I expect to see us
You
all
make it
here again.
We'll do nothing for you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.